Yeah, so I'm going to do something that is probably going to be quite surprising to most people. I come from Estonia. I'm not going to talk about Estonia at all today. So although Estonia is known globally as one of the leading e-government places in the world, but I'm not going to talk about at all about Estonia. Partially it is a conscious decision as well, because we want to actually focus more on the economy and societal issues rather than just e-government. Because Estonia, if we were to talk about e-government, then yes, we would need to focus much more on Estonia. But since the focus of this lecture and also Francesca's intervention later is much more on a wider digital impact on society and economy, and not only on the government. So if you think that the digital economy starts in 1971 with the first commercially available chip, then I think all of here are born later, I think, than 1971. I think all of us have been born later. So I think so means that everybody here has been actually born in the digital economy. So we are all part of the digital economy. So we should all know the topic of today's discussion quite intimately, actually. So we actually, because we have lived it and we are living it every day. So what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes, or close to that, I will try to go over the main discussions or the main topics around the digital economy. And there are actually many issues that we won't discuss in any detail, like privacy, for instance, that some of you might be having a more detailed interest, or even artificial intelligence. We won't go into that much of a detail, because partially these are very much a moving agenda, because they're very quickly or dynamic areas where changes are occurring almost on a daily basis, especially in artificial intelligence. So I'm trying to rather focus on more of the fundamental issues, if you will, in digital economy, and try to give you the essence of what the digital economy debate is about, if you will. What are the main areas that we need to be understanding when we want to govern the digital economy, and especially when we want to think about digital economy in the context of rethinking capitalism, rethinking economics. So I'm going to start with something what we call stylized facts. So I'm going to give you a few snapshots. I'm sure most of you will know, but this will sort of be a good introduction to this slide. I'm sure you have seen. So not only have we all been born into the digital economy, we are all born into economy that is basically getting more and more unequal. Especially the people at the lower end of the income spectrum are earning less and less. At the same time, the economy in itself is getting more and more productive. Now, it has something to do, obviously, with the digital economy, with ICT technologies and all that. But of course, it's just also a wider picture that we have to keep in mind when we talk about digital economy. The era we are in, the decades that have been preceding our talk here today, and that will also probably follow, are characterized both by the emergence of this new wave of technologies, but also the emergence of income inequality, and also the deepening of income inequality. So these are the two key backdrops, if you will. Now, some more data. So already in 2016, McKinsey published a report that argued that the value of global trade in data exceeds the global trade in goods, which seems quite difficult to imagine, because if you think how many goods countries are actually exporting and importing, how many cars, electronics, what have you, clothing, all of that is actually, goes around the world, and still the value of trade in data is larger. So we are already, even in terms of international trade, we are very much living in a digitally dominated economy. Even if you see a lot of physical things around us, even if you look at GDP and all that, we still look at physical infrastructure, physical products. The value in economy is very much actually already dominated by the digital values. And of course, on the other hand, this year, more than half of humanity will have access to internet. So it's not only that the trade is mainly digital, but also the communication has become increasingly digital. And you can say this is a rapidly expanding market space where more and more people go online almost every day. So it's more and more opportunities, if you will, are coming to the marketplace. So essentially, if you look at the largest companies by market capitalization in the world, again, most of the top 10 companies are actually about digital economy, or as Dan Hill has said, they're very much about user experience. So if you look at Googles or Amazons of this world, what they're actually selling you is the user experience of buying these products or using it for search or anything like, or Facebook and other companies like that. So they are actually, what they're selling and where they're making their money is the user experience. So they are not about physical goods. They are not about capital as such, investment into infrastructure or whatever, what have you, but they're actually selling you an experience. If you go home from here with an Uber, you use their app, and you're always asked to rate how was your experience on Uber, on Amazon, everywhere. How was your experience? So this is also the data that is generated very much is about your experience, but it has become very much an experience economy. And at the same time, if you look at the market shares of those companies, so this is a Google share in global search market, it's more than 90%. So it's one company that dominates global search market. So the experience in global search is dominated by one company. But this is Facebook's share in global media market. So it's more than 60%. It's almost 2/3 of global media, social media takes place on Facebook. Again, it's one company that essentially has less people than ICT department in Goldman Sachs, which is an investment bank. One of the largest investment banks in the world has more people working in their ICT department than Facebook has employees. And yet Facebook dominates social media market to the 2/3 of percent. And this is, again, I think a really amazing number. It's almost close to 50% of online retail sales go through one firm, Amazon, in US. Again, so it's in a way, there's more and more people on internet, but there is also less and less providers on internet, if you will. So the goods, the search, the social media, and all other aspects as well. So there is an expansion of the market space, but also a contraction of the market space to the hands of the much less than before. And of course, if you have followed the UK or international media this week, I think this was two days ago, Washington Post ran this headline that Amazon makes amazing profits without paying almost any tax. And this graph shows you the graph has become mangled a bit, but anyway, it shows you that the federal taxes they're paying have always been basically zero. At the same time, the profits have gone up to an amazing degree. So you have a marketplace that is expanding very rapidly, not by thousands and tens of thousands, but millions, even billions of people, and at the same time getting more and more concentrated into the hands of few companies that make unimaginable profits. It's 10 billion profits in 1 year. So obviously, what do? They want to go to the Mars, because where would you else put all that money? But if you go back to the beginnings of internet, so this is from John Barry Barlow. I think it's a very famous declaration of the independence of the cyberspace from 1996. And if you read this sentence, which is very much about governments and industry, leave internet alone. This is a space for a pure mind where prejudices and whatever skin color you have, whatever kind of person you are, should not play any role. So there was this dream of the internet, of the digital economy, as being this very much a democratic place. And if you look at all the sort of the snippets that I gave you before, it shows almost the opposite. It has become very much dominated by large corporations, or very few large corporations. So we live in a very strange area where more and more people have the chance to communicate, to create businesses from their home or even from their phone, and yet this marketplace, the value in this market is gathered into the hands of very few. And so what we're going to do in the next half an hour basically is very much around these two polar opposites. The promise of the internet area, the digital economy, that's very much about democratic access or democratizing the economy, if you will, and what is actually happening that is almost the opposite of it. And in the middle of it, we as users are actually enjoying a lot of new benefits. We can use new apps, we can get faster, more quicker. It's much more comfortable for us. It has become a very private world, because especially if you think about some of the apps like Waze, for instance, that is there to guide you through traffic. So the worse everybody else is doing, the better you are doing. So if everybody else sits in the traffic, you can bypass traffic. So that's the entire logic of it. It becomes very much a private experience. And this is what I'm trying to sort of tease out, those juxtapositions in the digital economy, that it has this great potential and great promise, and how it actually then happens. And I try to also explain why it is actually in the very nature of capitalist economies to evolve like that, to have this great promise of inclusive, democratic growth, and why it almost always goes wrong, and why you as citizens are being asked to fix it, or at least try to fix it, because it is all in all our hands to be more engaged with what happens in the economy. So if you try to define what is digital economy, I have here because it's of course a Twitter area, so I have a tweet from Evgeny Morozov, who's a very close friend of the Institute, and of course he's a very well-known polemicist of the internet era, if you will. So he writes quite often in The Guardian, but I think it's a very great person to follow on Twitter if you're interested in digital economy. And so he has, of course, it's a joke. It's what is digital economy? It's a digital economy essentially means that there's algorithms are talking to each other and making money for some people who own those algorithms. It sounds like a joke, but actually, if you look at internet traffic, half of internet traffic today is by bots, algorithms. So half of the traffic that goes around the world, which is larger than trade in goods, half of that traffic is not human. It's machines talking to each other and making money for somebody like Amazon. So it's not making money in terms of wages, but it's actually making enormous profits for somebody in the global economy. So while it is a joke, it is also, of course, a way that looks in the future, because if you think that artificial intelligence is where a lot of the technological development will be over the next 10 to 20 years, of course, this amount of traffic that goes from machine to machine, or algorithm to algorithm, to computer to computer, from website to website, is actually not based on human activity. So there is no sort of human engagement even needed, let alone wages and other issues like that. But this is something that we have to think about, and again, this becomes important later in the discussion. So from all the sort of literature around digital economy, I've tried to distill 3 key features of this economy. I'm sure there are many more, but I try to find 3 most important features of digital economy. The first one, and they're all related to the literature that you had to read for this particular session, so I hope you have done it, and I hope you recognize some of those issues. If you haven't done it, you should do it later today. So the first thing is that digital technologies are not only automating production processes, information processes. If you produce a car, you can use robots that do automatically some of those tasks and whatnot. But they're also what Susanna Zuboff calls, they informate. So digital technologies are actually learning themselves about you as a user, or even about their own processes. But this is, of course, what artificial intelligence means. It learns about itself, its own capabilities to detect errors, for instance, or to detect, for instance, skin cancer. So if you have an artificial intelligence program that looks at millions of pictures of skin cancer, it learns about itself, its own abilities. But of course, if you have algorithms that are used in Uber, Amazon, Google searches, they learn about you. So what digital economy has done in comparison to any economic technology before is created a learning into the technology itself. If you go back 50 years, even the most high-tech technologies, the learning happened within humans. It was human teams that learned how to avoid mistakes. So if you were a Japanese car manufacturer in the 1970s and you wanted to gain competitive advantage towards European, American car makers, what you had to do was to make quality in production better, avoid mistakes, have cars that don't break down, actually, that can go long distances, that have great user experiences. It was very much a human person who learned how to do better. It was teams, it was companies. All of the organizational science that we have now is about how to make teams work better, how to make teams learn. But digital economy has technology that is learning itself as well. So it's not only the humans that are learning, but it's also the technology. So the very infrastructure of the digital economy, algorithms, computer programs, they're learning about themselves and they're constantly learning about you. Remember, capitalism is about user experience. You're constantly giving feedback, even if you don't know it, to companies whose products you're using. So it's very much a learning economy, and it becomes really important later when we come back to the theory, what it means for economic theory. If economic theory, especially the organizational part of it, is very much about how we learn to do better. Innovation is, in many ways, is about learning to do things better, learning to have less mistakes, better quality, learning to cooperate with various companies across the various sectors. So this has huge impact, not only an influence on how economy functions, but also the way we actually think about theory, economic theory. The other thing, collective production of innovation. So you have all been today on Facebook. You have all been today on Google, I'm sure. You have all been using other electronic programs, devices. You have all created value for those owners of those companies, but you have all also participated in producing innovations. You have all said, you have searched for something and you have clicked on something. This has given Google information that this link is valuable. It is good that it's up there and not lower in the ranking. So you have given information, you have created innovation with them. Of course, innovation has always been social in its nature. If you think of it, even if you go back into the late 19th century, Norwegian-American economist Thorstein Veblen, he already then argued that innovation, economic development, is always a social process, because even if you produce everything in-house, you produce a car and you produce all the components, you still have to sell it. So that there have to be a consumer out there that actually likes it. You have to have some sort of communication. It is a social production of that innovation. Nobody can force you to sell it. But of course, nobody really produces everything in-house. You still have to cooperate with suppliers. You have to work together to make things happen in any economic processes. So it's always is a social process. But digital economy is massively so. It is all social creation of innovation, which is really fundamental. And if you go especially back to the promise of internet, that it will create opportunities for everybody to earn a living, to have a voice in politics and all that. So it is in the nature of internet to actually give you the voice, to give you the opportunity to work together. And of course, there is this thing like open source software, like Linux, for instance, that was created by what is called peer production, basically. People around the world produced a computer program software that is as good as anything that Microsoft or Apple have produced over the last 20 years. It is collectively produced, literally collectively, for no money. So there is this great potential to create something collectively, which has not been around in that massive scale as before. And of course, then there's also something that is called intangible capital, the rise of intangible capital. If you look at the way companies report their results, the way governments look at their budgets, or GDP, the way it's calculated, it's always about tangible assets like buildings, cars, computers, what do you want. It's all tangible capital that you can count, discount, whatever you have, it's there. But more and more, especially in the digital economy, intangible assets like human capital, like brands, all of these are much more important. So how do you calculate the value of teamwork, for instance? The value of being able to source ideas outside of your company, the value of being able to tap into the social networks of engineers, for instance. How do you actually work around those issues that are intangible capital? How do you calculate that, and how do you actually take into account? So, and the argument here is that digital economy is actually increasing the share of intangible capital. It becomes more and more important, and our metrics and systems around calculating capital are actually not taking that very much into account. And there is this Haskell and Westlake introduction that you have to read for this class, and this brings out all of those key issues. I just have a small footnote here. If you read it, if you want to have a laptop computer, you need a ton of metal, silicon, and plastic. So even if the in value or the size of intangible capital is increasing rapidly in the economy, it still has a major ecological footprint, of course, that we, again, don't actually take into account when producing these kind of intangible values. So, but this is just a footnote here that might make for an interesting discussion. So these are the key features of digital economy, if you will. So the economy that it itself has a learning potential in the technology itself, that it has a rise of intangible capital, intangible assets, and that is very much, where innovation in itself is very much a collective or a social nature. Now there's this great song from Casablanca, the movie. I'm sure you, from looking at your faces, you're probably not old enough to remember that movie. And today probably anyway, it's a great movie. There's this song where Sam, the bartender, sings, as you know, the fundamental things apply as time goes by, and it probably means quite something else about love and all that. But today we are looking at the economic theory, if you will, that there are some things that even if digital economy is really fundamentally changing a lot of the things around us, even in this fundamentally changing things, there are some economic facts, if you will, that remain the same. And I will talk about two people. Unfortunately, as usually we start from dead white males, and so this is Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, Austrian-American economist, who wrote in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, probably one of the most important economists of the 20th century, alongside with John Maynard Keynes, who was from Tisch Parish, quite literally. He lived and worked in Bloomsbury. And there's a Keynes house somewhere in the UCL campus, actually, so that's your homework. Go and find it later today. Anyway, Schumpeter was very much not Englishman, Austrian-American, and he had basically three theories why innovation happens in the economy. What drives companies to innovation? And first, when he was a young, 28, 30-year-old guy, he said, well, it's really about new firms. Innovation comes from new small companies, you know, the startup culture, if you will. But he wrote about it before the World War I even. He said, basically, innovations come from small companies. Then he got older and said, well, actually, innovations usually come from R&D departments of large companies. You have the Procter & Gamble's and all that really created in 1930s and 40s these large R&D departments, and this is where the innovation comes from. And then in one of his last books, he said, well, actually, innovation is much more of a process of what he called of imperfect competition. So if you want to understand why companies innovate, why do you have companies invest in new technologies or new services, new products, new marketing tools? And his point was because they want to literally ruin the competition. They don't want to live in a perfect competition world because nobody makes money in that world. But you can really make money if your products or services are difficult to copy and imitate, especially if you go and invest into new areas where there is market is increasing. So if you go and invest there, you can have a much larger share of market. And why imperfect competition matters in innovation, Schumpeter's argument was it matters because if you have imperfect competition and you have an increasing market share, you're actually learning more than your competitors. So now think about digital economy, what we talked about. The first feature of digital economy was that you have the technology itself is learning. So you have a rapid expansion of your market share if you are able to increase it. So like Google, for instance, or Amazon, or Facebook, that's why their market share is so much increasing, because it's not only about people in those companies learning to do things better, but it's actually the very technology itself is learning to do things better. So the more you go to Google, the more you go to Facebook, the more they learn about you, about their own technology, about their predictive value of their technology, whether they can actually predict who you're going to vote for, of course, you know, you remember from American elections, or what you want to do in your free time. So they learn about you all the time, but it's not actually people learning. It's not actually somebody going through the Excel sheets and saying, oh, this guy clicked on this link. It's actually algorithms, so the technology itself is constantly learning. So imperfect competition explains very well why the market shares of these companies, of dominant internet companies, is all the time increasing. because they have a competitive advantage. And if you today, if you want to create an online retail store like Amazon, how much money you would need to invest? Probably you can't even calculate the value of that, because their dominance, the competition is so imperfect. In case of Google, it's almost perfectly imperfect, because they have 92% of the market share. And this is, of course, what they want, because why would I want a competitor? Why would I want somebody competing with myself? And this is, of course, what the classical standard economic theory is unable to explain. And this is where Schumpeter especially is Mark III understanding of innovation. It is understanding innovation as an imperfect competition that creates creative destruction. Capitalism always creates something new. And what it creates are new needs. Nobody has a need for a mobile phone, but it creates it, and we carve it, and it's full of new opportunities, new technologies. It's full of money, but there is no need for that. There is no need for cars. There is no need for a lot of things that capitalism produces, but it's really, really good at it because it creates imperfect competition for those companies who can get ahead. But of course, if you think about now, even if you think that Google has 90% of market share, I don't want to compete with that. But still, it's only half of the global population that is online. It's only half. So it's a market for online stuff, whatever you want to do online or internet, is increasing rapidly. So it still makes sense to invest into this area. So the imperfect competition, actually, especially while the market is increasing, the market share is increasing, is really good time to invest. So that you have more and more people going into this economic activities. It draws you in, and it creates more and more opportunities, increasing new products, what have you. So imperfect competition, ironically, draws you in. So, but now we go to a very much alive female academician who works also at our institute, Carlotta Perez, and he will be, I think, exactly in a month's time speaking instead of me, or she will be, sorry. And she will, of course, expound on her theory much more than I will do. But what I wanted to show you is how this idea of imperfect competition and how this creates actually economic paradigms almost in the capitalism. So the capitalism constantly reinvents itself, but in this reinvention there is a pattern how this goes about. So she created this idea of techno-economic paradigms, and in her idea that capitalism reinvents itself every 50, 60, 70, whatever this time period is, and what is at the heart of this reinvention is a new common sense. The way we do business, the way we do anything in society gets reinvented periodically under capitalist systems, because the technologies are so pervasively changing what we do in society. But she, of course, will talk about it in much more detail. But what we are really interested in is this idea of new common sense. So if you see that digital economy is really changing rapidly everything around us, we want to understand what is it that is actually changing, what is actually around us changing. So this is her theory, and I won't really go into that. She will explain that, but this is really to show you how this technological wave, starting from the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s to our age, they really go through this massive investment mania, because everybody invests in new technology because they understand there's new needs, new human needs are being created. There's new market opportunities. Even if there's imperfect competition, I can still go in there, I can gain advantages, I can outcompete my competitors. And then you have a second phase of each revolution, where usually this new technological paradigm is being tamed or put into social use, socially valuable use. This is where you have government coming in, new institutional innovations like the welfare state, for instance, more than 100 years ago were created to actually to come back to that. And of course also, and this is just to show you that there is all these technologies go through these phases of initially very few companies, very few players being active, and then you have a rapidly expanding markets, market shares, new technologies, and new products available. And of course, you can think about, for instance, if you go back 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, what do you think was the most sexy product on the market? If you wanted to be really cool and startup-y, what did you do in 1919? The World War is over, I want to be an entrepreneur, I have money, I want to do a startup. What was the product that you really wanted to do then? Anybody know? It's still around, but nobody really uses it anymore. Sorry? Railway? No. It's much more smaller, it's much more... radio, yeah. Radio was like the sexiest industry in 1920s because it was the most high-tech industry. But of course now, I'm sure you can go home, Google how to do a radio, and I'm sure you can do it tomorrow. Have a radio by tomorrow. Imagine that. In 100 years, we have become such a huge... Because of this, because everybody understands radio is cool. Let's invest. Somebody gained advantage, and if somebody was actually Radio Company of America, or RSAA, that later then went into black and white television, color television, then you had video, then you had Japanese companies coming to compete, European companies to compete, all that, consumer electronics. So it went through this massive, massive increase. Once it became mature, everybody knows how to do it. The learning had been done. We know radio from A to omega. We know everything about radios. There is nothing to learn. We move on. And this is, of course, what Carlotta Perez's theory shows. This is what capitalism does. It destroyed all those nice things about radio. Well, it created radio 100 years ago, but now radio is an obsolete technology. We know how to deal with radio. Now artificial intelligence is where everybody wants to be because there's unimaginable opportunities for an economy. So now, according to Carlotta Perez's theory, we are exactly in the middle of this paradigm shift. We have had this disruption of marketplace. Everything is new. There's new companies, Googles, and they're dominating politics. They're dominating everything in society. And now it becomes the phase that usually capitalism looks at itself and says, damn it, we have maybe gone too far. Now we need to rein in our excesses, if you will. And so this is essentially, we are in the phase of social construction of the new common sense. So if you go back 100 years ago, what was this common sense about? This was very much about mass production. As you know, the Henry Ford saying, you can have my car in any color as long as it is, what color? Black. Black, exactly. If you go 100 years ago, and it lasted basically until 1980s, mass production system was really how you could create efficiency, new innovations, and everything. And of course, you had a massive socio-economic system around it. Consumer credit, for instance, was invented for mass production. You had also entire welfare state services were very much driven by capitalists, partially also, of course, by unions and other political fighters, if you will. But capitalists really liked welfare state because it created a system where even if you were sick or pregnant or you were old, you could still buy a new refrigerator, a new car, whatever. You had these products that you could always buy because you had welfare state. You had a support system that kept your credit going, essentially, if you will. So but now we are looking at what is the new common sense, if you will, for the coming age. So I will go rapidly through economy, society, and government. And I give you like opportunities. I don't think there is anything set in stone yet, if you will, about the capitalism that is digital economy. So that's what I mean by it. It's up to you to fight for what you actually want this economy to be about. Do you want this to be about large companies owning on data, earning money, untold fortunes, or you want to have this democratic opportunity and use something for what you want in terms of politics, in terms of economy, in terms of society? So in terms of economy, first of all, I think there's a big challenge to the entire idea. Why do we need firms when we can produce everything by peers, by crowdsourcing? Why do we need, if there is and you see, if you look around, there's increasing need for knowledge teams, if you will, knowledge communities. Everything can actually be created by working together across companies. And so why do we need firms? And there's a good argument to be made that firms are actually there to create those rent extraction possibilities, essentially, for the owners. There is not much more needed. So the entire nature of the firm, the idea of the firm is changing or can change. Do we need actually firms at all? And Joachim Benkler, whose essay, again, I think you had to read for this session, argues that actually firms are very much there to exploit the markets, the market opportunities, but not actually create something new. New innovations are very much created by what he calls knowledge communities, or actually algorithms, as we are in a digital economy. So if you look at a company like Uber, Uber essentially is a small company that actually has done away with a lot of the contractual, transactional relationships within the company or even the outside company. everything is done by algorithms. You as user are looking at it through algorithms, but even the drivers are actually managed by algorithms, not by people. So do you need, what do you need firms for actually, is a good question. But again, most of our accounting systems, most of our national accounts, balance sheets are actually based on firms, not very fluid knowledge communities that can be, some of them can be in London, some of them in New York, some of them in Italy, Estonia, wherever, and they can create something together. So how do you actually even look at the economy and understand it through accounting systems where there's such a fluidity and firms are becoming obsolete? But the same thing about the nature of the market. We can argue that yes, like Linux, like a lot of open software, open source software, we can actually produce a lot of things on open source, peer production. We don't need actually to have these kind of markets as we have now. The opposite to that is actually the platform, what is called platform economies, like Google and Amazon are increasingly becoming. Through their dominance, they're actually offering other companies to use their services increasingly. And of course, again, learn about those businesses, learn about those economies, and become more knowledgeable. And again, it's our choice almost, whether we want platform economies, whether we want peak platform companies, or we want something that is much more democratic, much more distributed, much more perhaps also egalitarian than these platform economies. So this, we are at the crossroads, if you will, and we can influence that. You can influence that by the choices you make on a daily basis. Whether you use Uber or taxis in London, for instance, is influencing what kind of economy we will have in the future. The same can be said about property and commons. If we can produce almost all the innovations we need, we want, collectively, like open source software, do we need property? Or for what do we need property, actually? Why don't we have more commons type of ownership? Should actually data be a commons that is actually owned by everybody and nobody at the same time? So how do we then use it if we don't think of data as property, through property rights? So what kind of terminology, what kind of institutions should we actually think about in using those? And again, there is nothing in set in stone. There is no trajectory that we have to go towards more private property. But then it's up to you as knowledgeable people, young people, the way you consume, the way you are actually looking at the digital economy and understanding it, is up to you to make which way we go, more towards commons ownership of data, that we can use data, for instance, in health for diseases and creating a better health service, or we going towards a health system that is actually, again, creating a lot of profits for those who own the data. Society, we can, again, look at the way the digital economy is changing. We look at the idea of welfare services or welfare state. So welfare state was very much based on the idea of universality, the idea that everybody in the welfare state health system, and NHS, of course, in UK is a prime example, everybody is part of it. You have health coverage. And most European countries, of course, have that. So we are moving away from a universalistic, if quite inefficient system, towards something that promises the personalized approach to you as personal medicine, for instance. So again, we have a choice whether we think that universality is more important than personalized approach to me. And as I said, everything in technology, or it makes possible, digital technology makes both possible, but we have the choice, if you will, of which way we actually want the society to develop in terms of public services. And in the same way, of course, if you look at the welfare state, it was very much around the idea of a statistical human being, how we are on average, how human beings are on average. So it's you have 2 children, this is what you should eat, 2,000 calories a day, you should have how many types of vegetables, and 5 types, I guess, in the UK you're supposed to have. Everything is about the statistical averages. But now we're moving, or there's a potentiality to go more automated self. You're being told by your Fitbit or by your phone when to eat, when to do what. So it's much more about automated self. And again, it's up to us whether how much automation we want around our own self-identity, and how should we actually go about this sort of data. And again, if you think about the previous paradigm where we come from, the mass production, unionized labor, all of these systems that were actually making the system work, they relied very much on the idea of countervailing power. If you had big industry, you had also big labor. You had countervailing power. Nobody had too much power, if you will. So today we have digital nomads. We have people who work 2 weeks in London, 2 weeks in Vietnam, whatever they go around. They work in teams that are working very much globally. So how do we actually think about even the welfare state systems for these kind of people? Where should they pay taxes, for instance? And all these things. So government, again, if you look at the previous paradigm where we come from, the mass production systems, it's very much about having a stable and quite predictable government services. And of course, it's understandable. If you pay into a pension fund for 40 years, you don't want anybody to experiment with that fund, right? You want that to be predictably safe. But today, we are very much in the idea of agility, that governments should react very quickly to the changing environment. Governments should be focusing on experimentalism. They should experiment, like with universal basic income, for instance. Finland is a country that does it a lot and very much. Again, we are thinking that government should go from reacting to the large-scale change in the economy to being much more anticipative and trying to predict what will happen. So you have all these kind of new services emerging, like predictive policing. If you might have heard about it, there is using big data to predict where crime would happen. And of course, again, the problem is how do we actually engage with these kind of potentialities that actually have in themselves also the potentiality to be actually rather exclusive and biased. So there is, for instance, a case study in the US where judges are using increasingly algorithms to tell them how to sentence somebody. There are sentencing guidelines. You can sentence somebody from 10 to 28 years, and the computer actually suggests a sentencing time. And there is research that shows that if you happen to be black male, your sentence will be much more harsher. So even the learning machines can be biased like humans are. So again, even if we go from reaction to anticipation, we might take our own biases with us. And the last thing here in terms of government, again, even governments are becoming much more thinking about platforms, offering you a service that is much more on the platform-like thing. Either you are a private sector or a public sector organization, you can use like platform in terms like payment system, identity system, so you can use it for various services. And of course, even governments are increasingly looking at automating services. So this is the only place I will mention Estonia. Estonia's recent initiatives are around automating the service, a lot of services in a way that, for instance, if your child is born, you automatically receive an email with the identity number of this child and the next steps you have to take, when you have to go to the kindergarten. But all the sort of the service provision is done quite in an automatic fashion. So you can also see here that there is an idea that we want to actually circumvent human agency, avoid errors, and provide this kind of service. But of course, again, the question is about inclusion and whether these kind of services and platforms are actually more exclusionary or rather more exclusionary. And this is, of course, something that Francesca will be talking much more than I will. And the last thing I'll leave you with this Facebook slogan and the changing slogan of Facebook, which I think really characterizes the time we are in. As you might know, Facebook started out, their slogan was move fast and break things, which is very much a sort of a digital economy mantra of trying to move fast, create new services, experiment, find what works, what doesn't. If it doesn't work, let's go to the next thing. And now Facebook has changed, move fast with stable infrastructure. And so I think this idea of stability, that we need to somehow have a social control around technology, this is the time we are at. And I think this is what I mean, that you all are asked or tasked to actually give your voice how we should actually create this more stable infrastructure around digital economy in terms of that being more inclusive, in terms of it being more democratic, and in terms of having more ownership of issues like digital economy area. Thanks so much.